such an asshole.
All right, Cappy gonna pull off his economics here. I actually have to go and use my education. Cappy, you like short questions. Can you explain spending to GDP, debt to GDP, tax burden, and how they measure the financial health of a country? Also, interesting figure. I found Japan's debt to GDP ratio is over 200, while the U.S. is a little over 100. So, okay, sure. First, don't even think about money. We're not talking about money. Money does not matter here. All right, so yen, dollar. We're just talking about stuff. And the reason we talk about stuff in economics is because that's the only thing you can or use. You can't eat money. Well, you can, like Venezuelans. Oh, you thought communism would work. But money is a tool by which we trade the stuff we make. So technically, the economy is not money. It is stuff. And then GDP. So let's talk about GDP. GDP is gross domestic product, meaning how much stuff do we produce in a year? Now, this could be how much does a city produce? That's called gross municipal product. You get larger to a state or province. It's called gross state product. How much did that state make? You get gross domestic product, which means the entire economy or nation. And then there's global GDP, which is just how much does the world produce? How much stuff do we produce? And so that's GDP in general. And sometimes people say GDP, they mean nation usually, but what's the global GDP? Okay, that's global. But what's the state's GDP? They should technically say gross state product, but I'm not expecting everybody to be educated in basic economics because then you might vote conservative. So it's basically how much stuff do we produce? Also services. What services do we provide? Anything of value. How much stuff of value do we produce? And that's economics. That's your economy. That's all it is. The more stuff you produce, the better. The more you pay fat, lazy people to stay at home and not work, or you don't let them go work, the less stuff gets produced, and then you're poor. It doesn't matter how much money you print off. So once we have this number, GDP, state, federal, local, national, global, doesn't matter, that basically is our income. How much money did we generate? Now you can introduce money because, okay, what's the market value? What are people willing to pay for a gallon of gas or a Big Mac or some consulting services at assholeconsulting.com? And so then you put a dollar or yen or a currency measurement. It's a unit of measurement of value on all the stuff you produce. I think the United States, we're at like $22 trillion worth of GDP. I think global production is 90 trillion. I think we're at 90 trillion. I'd have to look it up. So that's how much stuff in terms of dollars we produce. Cars, movies, sex workers, fans only. I mean, it counts. It counts. So you got GDP. And then once we have, okay, what do we produce? Now we could say, okay, as a percentage of our production, as a percentage of our income we generate, what do we spend things on? How much debt do we have? And it's very analogous, almost perfectly analogous to your gross income, right? So anytime you look at a governments are no different than humans. They're just bigger and more corrupt. Governments have a certain amount of money. Economies make a certain amount of money. Individuals make a certain amount of money. Okay, what percent of my gross income do I borrow against? What percent of my income am I paying out on security or defense or something like that? So comparing GDP to your personal budget, starting with gross income, will allow you to analyze this. So he wants to know a couple things. Spending to GDP. All right. Usually what that means is what is government spending as a percent of GDP? Now, this is, I would say, the most important figure in economics for any layman or person who's not interested in economics to know. You just want to know the basics. Spending as a percentage of GDP shows you how big the government is as a percent of your total economic production. Right? You can look this stuff on websites like OECD.org. And just Google search it, I guess, too. And you'll see communist countries. Well, the government takes everything because that's communism. So Venezuela, North Korea, Cuba, to a lesser extent, for the most part, the government owns all the means of production. It takes all your money. It takes all your property. It technically never allows you to have property in the first place. The government is the economy. So government spending by its structure, it necessitates that it's 100% GDP. Then you get into, and there is no anarchist economy that exists where there is no government. I don't want you libertarians to tell me there. Just shut the fuck up. I don't need to hear it. You need some kind of government. You need some kind of law. And so there might be minarchists, but those don't. The United States was one time a minarchist, meaning 2-3% spending GDP. But nowadays, what is it? I think like Singapore, Liechtenstein, Monaco, the United Arab Emirates. There's a handful, the Cayman Islands, Bermuda. There's some exceptions out there, examples of very low tax country. And I'd have to look it up, but you're talking about 10% GDP. So you produce all your stuff, you make $100,000, you pay $10,000 to the government, and it takes care of the roads and the schools and the defense and everything like that. So that's on one extreme end. The United States, where I'd have to look it up, but I'd have to estimate we're at 45% GDP spending under Trump. We were at one time 3%, but who wants to keep 97% of your income? Single moms with rat bastard children need money. Oh, okay, here you go. Every kid has a father. It's called a taxpayer nowadays. I don't have a father. Sure you do. All those hardworking men that pay the taxes, that's your father. They pay for everything. And the government takes a cut. So we're not really a capitalist economy. We're a quasi-socialist economy. And then you have countries like Sweden or Finland where 60% GDP the government takes and spends. Now, here's a little bit of a problem. That's spending as a percent of GDP. That says nothing about revenues. And as you may know, especially here in the United States, we've been running deficits. So just because the government spent, $9 trillion in government spending, state, federal, and local, that doesn't mean they took in $9 trillion or $9.2 trillion in tax revenues. They take in $7 trillion. They take in $8 trillion. Then you run a deficit. And so what the government has to do is it either has to print off more money, borrow money from overseas, or its people issuing bonds, or a combination of both they can do, and that's what we've been doing. And so that results in each deficit you run each year, that just like if you spend more than you take in, you have to borrow the money on your credit card, borrow it from a bank, whatever. And the more each year you spend more than you take in, you start to accrue a debt. At a governmental level, it's called your national debt. Okay. I think the federal government debt, as you pointed, is 105, 110% GDP, meaning we could tax all of you for an entire year and enslave you to the government. We still wouldn't have paid off the national debt. Japan would have to enslave its people for over 2 years to pay off its national debt. And at one time, and this was under Clinton, although not his fault, he didn't do anything for it, we were down to 39% debt to GDP because we had some surpluses and GDP was growing very quickly. A good situation to be in. But every year you have a deficit to GDP, somewhere between 2 to 5%, 6, 7, you're doing bad. That accrues over time. You add it to your debt, and then you have your debt to GDP. And debt to GDP is bad. And the reason why is because that's just how much more taxes we've kicked down into the future. We've kicked down into the future, boomers and Gen Xers, and you millennials now, you're responsible too. Welcome to the club. You decided to vote in politicians who decided to spend more, Trump included, Bush Jr. included too, by the way. It's not just Democrats or Republicans. To amass a national debt, say, well, you kids pay it. We'll be dead. Pay our Social Security, by the way, though, too, kids. And one of the main reasons I hate the boomers. One of the main reasons. So a lot of people would say, well, no, the tax rates aren't that high, Aaron. The tax rates is revenue as a see, my tax rate is this low. It's like, yeah, but the government borrowed money, which taxpayers, that means you, has to pay back, or it printed off more money, which just means we've diluted the purchasing power of everybody's money. When money printer goes burr and you just print off more money, well, that means there's more dollars out there in the market, and that means it takes more dollars to buy. Did you millennials notice how you just could not get the semen of Obama's jizz is just encrusted on your face though because you just sucked his dick so much. He almost quadrupled the money supply, and you thought it was great. Yay, Obama! Oh, come all over me, Mr. President. Well, the money will find its way into asset prices, which it did. And how's that rent coming along? Can you afford rent or are you living at home? You can't escape it. It is a tax. And depending on how your financial system is set up, The money might flow and increase the price of milk, consumer goods. It might increase the price of cars in the United States. Anything banks lent out on, that increased the price. Healthcare, y'all bitch about the price of healthcare. Housing costs, y'all bitch about the price of it. Did you borrow money for education? Oh, I wonder if lending $500 billion a year into the housing market, money printer go burr, had anything to do with increasing tuition. But no, you're all college educated millennials. You know so much. It's a tax. It's called inflation, but it's a tax. And it's spread out pretty universally. And I would say it disproportionately hurts the poor, ceteris paribus, depending on, again, how the flows are through your financial system. Regardless, the argument then means that your real tax rate is your spending as a percent of GDP. Oh, you may try and play some generational war games by having future generations pay for it. We'll just borrow the money, okay? Or you might try to hide it by printing off the money printer go bird. See, look at the stock market. It's gone up and the housing prices has gone up. Yay for us. Doesn't it mean it's more costly for young people to retire and they have to pay a lot more in rent and mortgage prices and mortgage interest now? But my housing price went up. Yay for me. If any of this is too complex and advanced to you people, I understand most of you fell asleep in economics class because it wasn't fun or sexy. So when the government spends, whether it has the money or not, whether it borrows against the people of the future or it prints it off, that is your overall tax rate. So you take what you paid in, revenue as a percent of GDP, you add any amount of deficit spending and how much money printer went burr. And that spending, it would be totaled up in government spending divided by GDP. That is your real tax rate. That's what you're paying, universally, generally speaking. Debt to GDP we covered. I know you weren't asking about revenue to GDP. We already talked about that. Tax burden. Tax burden, there is no official definition. The most common use of that is through, I think it's the Hoover Institute or Heritage. Maybe it's the Heritage Foundation. And other economists or economic think tanks or research places will use the term tax burden, but it's not universally, it's not specifically defined. But generally what it means is how much total taxes does this particular country pay? And what should it be, boys and girls? Spending as a percent of GDP. However, usually when you hear tax burden, it's in the context of some kind of analysis. They're trying to analyze which countries are most free, which countries are most business friendly. Very commonly, they'll do it with states. And it's never consistent, never. I just wish they would do spending percent GDP. California, Minnesota, New York, whatever. But a lot of times when they're looking at businesses, like how business friendly, well, they're only going to focus on business taxes or corporate taxes. They're not going to focus on sales or property taxes or income taxes or dividends or capital gains. They'll also look at things like regulation and compliance costs with those regulations. Some economists would argue it is also a tax or a burden. It's certainly a burden. I don't know if I call it a tax. So there's no consistent measure of tax burden. You know, and one study will mean this, and they'll show you the methodology. Oh, we included this and multiplied it by that. And you'll see a logic. Oh, okay, you're focusing on business taxes. Oh, we did this and we focused on that. And, okay, you're focusing on overall taxes. Oh, we did this and we did that. Oh, you're focusing on individual personal taxes. By the way, all taxes are personal. Didn't know if you knew that. The evil corporate. Remember the evil corporate? Man, that's a coup d'etat. That's a marketing genius thing that the corporations finally got you guys off their ass. The evil corporations. You guys think they're the greatest corporations. They put a rainbow flag or a Black Lives Matter. You're like, oh, okay, here's my money now. Like, yeah, they really care about political issues. So then how do they measure the financial health of a country? Same thing as it would an individual. Ideally, you want no debt. You want as low spending and low revenue percent of GDP because it means you're not taxing the shit out of your citizens. Socialists and parasites and communists and leftists in general don't want to work, so they want free shit. Okay, so they're going to argue like Sweden and Finland are great. Look at them, they're 60% GDP. It's like, yeah, 6 out of every 10 of your dollars goes away. And by the way, if you ever do look at this socialist system, you'll find out everyone pays that tax. It's not like, oh, just the rich. No, poor people pay taxes too over there. But that's just, yeah, and that's it. I would argue the higher the percent, obviously, spending to GDP, the less free you are, because that basically, let's say you have spending as a percentage of GDP at 60%. That means 60% of your money goes to other people in the government. Now, some things you want to pay the government for: roads, cops, defense, bridges, maybe an argument for schools. I'm not against like some basic level of education. And so, but when it's like, oh yeah, pay Amy, the single mom, thrice over to spit out some bastard kids, bail out Thaddeus McWinthrop III, who majored in dipshittery philosophy studies at an overpriced. We got to bail him out, bail out bankers. No, you all suffer. You all suffer. But you guys vote to enslave yourselves because that way you can pay for other people's shit. And sometimes people just vote Democrat, leftist, socialist because it feels good. They want to be popular. Women. See, I just want to let you know I care. And even though it's not economically feasible and we enslave everybody 60% of the working year here in Finland, I feel good about myself, and that's the most important thing. I care about you by giving you other people's money and enslaving them. Yeah, I mean, what would it be like? You work really hard, and you make $100,000, and 60,000 of it is taken away, and based on government budgets, 45,000 of that is given to other people, and only 15 is spent on roads you might use. I mean, it's horrific. It's disgusting. And it's not sustainable in the long run, but you guys will find that out pretty soon. And then in terms of debt, yeah, you'd like to have no debt to GDP. You'd like to have a net assets. There are some countries that don't have debt to GDP. They have assets to GDP. Singapore, Norway, but Norway has oil. I think Saudi Arabia had that for a while, where they have they call it a sovereign wealth fund, where it's like, well, we got money left over. You run a surplus. Okay, well, let's throw that over here. Ballpark, like if you had a surplus, well, let's park it in a stock account or something like that. Government's just got a lot more zeros added onto it. So you'd like to have assets as a percent of GDP, not debt. But money printer go burr, and debt and deficits don't matter. And the funny mustached bearded guy, Paul Krugman, and his equally funny looking counterpart, Robert Reich, they're actual like doctorates in economics. And what's so sad is they have their degrees and they know better, but they'll lie to you. People tell you deficits and debt don't matter. It's just money printer go burr. Why is housing so expensive? And they're like, hee. At least the New York Times paid me my money to tell people what they wanted to hear. They're actually quite genius. They are like Derek Jackson and Matt Hussey. They're Operation Evil. They know exactly what they're doing. But he said we could just print all the money and then the problems go away. Oh, yay! And I should even slam on leftists because, to be truthful, Republicans, even since Reagan ran huge deficits, Trump, I think, doubled the money supply on top of Obama. So you can't even be political about it. I just find these economists despicable, where they do these contortions to say, oh yeah, we can print off all the money in the world. Oh really? Why did that work for the Weimar Republic or Yugoslavia in 1993 and 94? Why did money printer go burr work? What about Zimbabwe? Zimbabwe should be kicking ass. Oh, money printer go burr. All right. Speaking of economists, Fred Freeman Sowell for $2. What's a Paul Krugman? An economics term? A Paul Krugman is this short little scumbag who just knows exactly what he's doing. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to tip my hat to him because I'm going to be doing the same thing. I'm just going to be lying to the American people. He's an economist. He's just like, if it was Return of the Jedi, he would definitely be a Sith. He'd be he's on the dark side of the Force. I'm going there too. Don't worry. It's not a DJ Aftershock. Guahaha. Oral Paul Krugman. Shlong. Yo. Modern monetary theory says we can print as much money as he wants as Krugman, bro. If aliens came in and just dropped a ton of money on us. Fred Freeman Sowell, $5. This goes for the Atham Fund. Okay, I'll got to keep a tab on these. Hey, some of us millennials used to tell our liberal pro-Obama professors that they and he are economically illiterate and still got a 3.9 GPA. Yeah, I told my theater professor. He was slamming on Ronald Reagan, because it was long ago. I said, what do you have your degree in? He says, theater. I said, not economics? He's like, yeah. And I went, Forgot to pay VAT in Israel. Sorry, Cap ancestors. Does Israel have a value-added tax? All right, there you go. All right, so hopefully that explains some terms you might like to understand. If you want to learn more about economics and in a good and practical way, not the boring way that they taught you in school and college, and not the Marxist way, like the real world way, there's a book I have out there. It's called Bachelor Pad Economics. Find that on Amazon, paperback and Kindle. It does say Bachelor Pad Economics, but it is also, women can read that too. The numbers don't change. But it is tailored to men, so you know it'll be true and it won't lie. If you want lies, there's plenty of girls out there that wrote books like, hey, the vagina retirement. I don't know. Just go look, just because I'll tell you this, the numbers don't change. It doesn't change. Oh, here we go. Hopefully vasectomy price inflation stays low. Yep. Did we get them all? We got them all. All right. See you guys later. Toodles.